I found something in Eleanor's garage that I wasn't supposed to find. I remember standing there holding it, knowing that if I opened it, I would never feel safe in this house again. Something she'd hidden so carefully that it took me 4 weeks of cleaning to discover it. My name is Linda, and for 3 decades I've lived in this Virginia house with my husband Matthew and his mother Eleanor. We moved in together right after our wedding, when I was young and hopeful about the family we'd build. That hope died slowly, one negative pregnancy test at a time, until the word childless became as much a part of my identity as my own name. Eleanor made sure I never forgot it. "What kind of woman can't give her husband a child?" she'd whispered once. But this morning was different. Eleanor had died 4 weeks ago, her sharp tongue finally silenced by Alzheimer's disease that had ironically been the only thing to give me relief in recent years. Matthew had gone to work early, leaving me to sort through her belongings, a task I'd volunteered for, partly out of duty and partly because I wanted to reclaim this house, to make it ours without her disapproving presence lurking in every corner. I'd been methodical about it, starting with her bedroom, moving through the living spaces, saving the garage for last because I knew it would be the hardest. Eleanor had stored decades of memories out there, boxes stacked to the ceiling like monuments to a life I'd never been allowed to fully understand. The October air was crisp against my skin as I climbed the stepladder, pulling down containers marked in her careful handwriting. Christmas decorations 1985, Matthew's school papers, wedding china. Each box told the story of a family I joined but never truly belonged to, at least not in Eleanor's eyes. Then I saw it, tucked so far back behind old paint cans that it was almost invisible. A small wooden chest, maybe the size of a jewelry box, with brass corners that had turned green with age. No label, no indication of what it might contain. Something about its hidden placement made my pulse quicken. The chest was locked, but the key was taped to the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at my touch. Eleanor had wanted this found, I realized, but only by someone who looked carefully, someone who wasn't afraid to dig deep into places others might avoid. My hands trembled as I turned the key. The lock clicked open with the soft sound of secrets being released into daylight they were never meant to see. Inside, tied with a faded blue ribbon, lay a stack of papers that would change everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the woman who'd made my life a careful kind of hell. The first page didn't make sense at first. A name I knew, written in a way I'd never seen before. A date that didn't belong to any story I'd ever been told. The paper slipped from my fingers like water. I sank onto an overturned crate, my legs suddenly unable to support me. This couldn't be real. Matthew had never mentioned any of this. There were no signs, no hints, no gaps in family photos. Yet here was legal proof of something Eleanor had hidden for decades. Beneath the papers lay a letter, written in Eleanor's younger handwriting. "To whoever finds this," it began, "I pray it will be Matthew himself, when I'm no longer here to face his questions. I'm not proud of what I'm about to confess, but I need someone to know the truth. I married Robert Sullivan in 1959, believing we'd fill this house with children's laughter. For 8 years we tried. Month after month I'd pray for the signs that never came. I'd stand in baby departments touching tiny clothes, imagining how they'd look in the nursery we'd painted yellow. The doctors had words for women like me: barren, defective, incomplete. Each appointment brought new tests and new terminology for my failure, until I began to believe that my body was simply wrong, built for a purpose it could never fulfill. Robert grew distant first, then angry, then absent. He started working later, coming home with the smell of perfume that wasn't mine. When Dr. Harrison finally confirmed what we both knew, that I would never carry a child, Robert packed his bags the same day. That's when I understood why she'd been so cruel to me all these years. "What's the point of having a wife who can't be a mother?" he asked, standing in our doorway with his suitcase. "You're not really a woman at all, are you?" Those words would echo in my mind for years, shaping every relationship I'd try to build, every prayer I'd whisper in the dark. He left me with nothing but this house and the crushing weight of my own inadequacy. I needed to prove I could be a mother, even if I couldn't create a child. He became my proof that I wasn't a complete failure as a woman, my evidence that I could nurture something But the pain never left me. It lived in my chest like a stone, growing heavier with each passing year. When Matthew brought Linda home, I saw my younger self in her eager eyes, her gentle hands that automatically reached for other people's babies, her hopeful questions about our family medical history. Watching her fail at the same thing I'd failed at should have created sympathy between us. Instead, it opened old wounds I'd thought were healed. Every time I looked at her flat stomach, I remembered my own. Every time Matthew comforted her after another negative test, I remembered Robert walking away. Every time she smiled hopefully at a baby in the grocery store, I remembered the nursery we'd never used, still painted yellow after all these years. I know I've been cruel to her. I know I've said things that were meant to wound. The truth is, Linda reminds me of everything I lost, everything I could never be. She deserves better than the bitterness I've carried, but I don't know how to give her anything else. Every morning when I see her, I see the woman I used to be, and I remember how that woman died a little more each month when hope turned to disappointment. If you're reading this, Matthew, I hope you can forgive me for the lies. You were the best thing that came from the worst period of my life, and I've loved you as fiercely as any mother could love her child. You saved me when I thought there was nothing left to save. If you're reading this, Linda, I hope you can understand that my cruelty was never really about you. It was about the woman I used to be, the one who died a little more each month when hope turned to disappointment. Seeing you go through what I went through brought back every moment of pain I'd tried to bury. I've kept this secret because I was afraid Matthew would stop loving me if he knew the truth, afraid the world would see me as the fraud I've always believed myself to be. Maybe it's time for honesty. Maybe it's time for healing. Eleanor, some truths are easier to hide than to say out loud. The letter fluttered to the garage floor as the full weight of revelation settled over me. For 30 years, I'd endured Eleanor's cruelty, believing it stemmed from her disappointment in my inability to continue her family line. But she hadn't had a family line to continue. Her son, our son, came from a different kind of love, the desperate love of a woman trying to rebuild her shattered life. All those years, she'd been looking at me and seeing herself. All those years, she'd been punishing me for reminding her of her own pain. The garage suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. I gathered the papers with shaking hands, my mind racing through decades of memories that now carried different meanings. The way Eleanor sometimes watched Matthew with an expression I'd interpreted as possessive, but now recognized as grateful. The way she'd flinch whenever anyone mentioned how much Matthew resembled his father. The way she'd change the subject whenever baby pictures were mentioned. How had Matthew never known? How had I never suspected? But even as I asked these questions, I understood. Eleanor had been methodical about her deception. She'd created a narrative and stuck to it so completely that even she'd seemed to believe it. Matthew had been too young when she adopted him to remember his life before, and she'd been careful never to let contradictions slip. The sound of tires on gravel made me look up. Matthew's car was pulling into the driveway, 2 hours earlier than usual. I quickly stuffed the papers back into the chest, my heart pounding with the weight of what I now knew. He couldn't learn about this here, surrounded by dusty boxes and the scent of old paint. This truth deserved better. A soft place to land, careful words, time to process the impossible. "Linda!" Matthew's voice echoed through the garage. "You okay out here?" "Fine," I called back, my voice steadier than I felt. "Just finishing up." But nothing would ever be fine again. Not in the same way. That evening, after we'd shared dinner and talked about ordinary things, his day at the office, my progress with Eleanor's belongings, plans for the weekend, I set the wooden chest on our kitchen table. The same table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together, where Eleanor had served dinner for 30 years, never once revealing the secret that lived in her chest like shrapnel. Matthew looked at it curiously, recognizing nothing familiar in its weathered surface. "I found this today," I said quietly, "hidden in the garage. I think you need to see what's inside." He opened it slowly, the same way I had. I watched his face change as he read, confusion giving way to disbelief dissolving into something deeper and more complex. The adoption papers trembled in his hands, and when he looked up at me, his eyes held questions I couldn't answer. "I don't understand," he whispered. "This has to be a mistake." I reached across the table and took his hand in both of mine. "Read the letter, Matthew." He did, and I watched 38 years of assumed identity crumble around him. When he finished, he set the letter down carefully, as if it might disappear if handled too roughly. "She never said anything," he murmured. "All these years, and she never said anything." We sat in silence for a long time, the tick of the kitchen clock marking moments that felt suspended between one reality and another. Finally, Matthew spoke again, his voice hollow with confusion. "Who am I then?" he asked quietly. I reached for his hand, but I couldn't answer, because I didn't know anymore either. But even as I said the words, I knew something fundamental had shifted, not in how I saw him, but in how he would see himself. Eleanor's secret had protected him from questions about his origins, but it had also stolen his right to know where he came from. That night, I watched him sleep beside me and realized I didn't know which of us had lost more. The information was sparse, a birth name he'd never known, fragments of a life before Eleanor. Each small detail felt significant, but none of it made him feel more like himself. As for me, Eleanor's letter had changed something deep in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly. Her words had done damage that couldn't be simply erased by understanding their source. But the sharp edge of old hurts had dulled, replaced by something more complex. For 30 years, I'd carried her cruelty like stones in my pockets, weighing down every step. Now I understood that she'd been carrying her own stones, her own burden of pain that she'd never known how to set down. She'd been wrong to hurt me, but she'd been hurting too. What I found in that cemetery would change everything one final time. One Sunday morning, 6 weeks after finding the chest, I drove to Elmwood Cemetery. Eleanor's grave was still marked only by a temporary marker, the headstone not yet ready. I brought yellow daffodils, her favorite, and sat cross-legged on the grass beside her plot. The morning air was cool against my skin, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing, calling people to worship and forgiveness. "I know now," I said quietly to the turned earth. The cemetery was peaceful, but my chest felt heavy with questions that would never have answers. Understanding wasn't the same as forgiving, and knowing why she'd hurt me didn't erase 30 years of wounds. "You should have told me," I whispered. A soft breeze stirred the daffodils, but Eleanor wasn't there to respond. Some conversations happened too late. When Matthew found me there 20 minutes later, he was carrying his own small bouquet of white roses. We stood together in comfortable silence, two people learning to rebuild their understanding of family and belonging. "Do you think she loved me?" he asked eventually. I thought about Eleanor's letter, about 38 years of secrets, about pain that had shaped all of us in ways we were only beginning to understand. "I don't know," I said quietly. "I don't know anything anymore." As we walked back to the car, Matthew took my hand in his. Eleanor's secret had shaken everything we thought we knew, but questions weren't the same as answers. Sometimes it just shows you how broken things really were.